Hey, what's up, guys? You're now listening to Devo with Uncle Theo. Today is day 101, and we made it to another book, 2 Samuel. We're going to cover chapters 1 and 2 today. But before we get started, we have to remember that God has established Israel in the land, and we've moved our focus from patriarchs to individual leaders to judges, and now we're focused on kings, not just kingdom, but king. And through it all, we've been establishing a theology of kingship. And Israel all along was to understand that God was their true king. They were to be a theocracy. So it was okay to have a king just as long as they understood that God was their true king. But the problem came in, as we saw in 1 Samuel, is that Israel would look over at the other nations and say, we want that. And that became problematic. They wanted a king that was right from the world's perspective. And it's everything that you would want in a king. They wanted a tall king, a handsome king, but this mission fails utterly. But now we're about to see kingship further established. And I'm going to borrow an outline from my professor, Dr. Chou, when he works through the book of 2 Samuel. He calls it the 4 F's. One is fusion, the other is formulation, the other is failure, and the last one is future. And so by fusion, what we mean is we have a king dying, and we're going to have the rightful king fused into kingship. Formulation, we're going to get our third covenant. We're going to get a new covenant, the Davidic covenant, very soon. That's going to come up in 2 Samuel chapter 7. But then we're going to see failure. I hate to break the news to you, but as great as David is, he's not going to be our guy. He's not the Messiah. But the humanity of the Messiah is in him. It's in the loins of David. So David is an ancestor of Jesus Christ. And future, since David cannot fulfill this, who can be the king that can fulfill the covenant? The answer is going to be no man can do this. And so that's going to make the way for the prophets for us. The prophets are going to teach us that because no man can do this, we need God to come down. We need God to do this. So that's going to start building our theology of the God-man. So remember the 4 F's. That's what we're going to cover here. Fusion, just a shepherd boy running away from Saul. And even though he's positionally king, he has to practically fuse David into the role of king. Formulation, we'll get the Davidic covenant. Failure, and most of this book of 2 Samuel is going to focus on David's failure. And there's a reason for this, because it's going to set up for a future that no man can fulfill the Davidic covenant. And the beautiful thing about the Davidic covenant is he who rules the Davidic covenant rules all covenants. And because you rule the Davidic covenant, you can make, guess what? A new covenant. So think about the Davidic covenant as the covenant that rules them all. It controls everything. And David understands this when he writes certain psalms. And I'll try to demonstrate this for you. But we walk into chapter 1, and God officially begins to mold David into the king of Israel. It says in verse 1, now it came about after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David remained in Ziklag. On the 3rd day, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes torn and dust on his head. And it came about when he came to David and fell to the ground and prostrated himself. So what's about to happen here is David is about to get his big test. He's about to get another test, another examination. You know how God works. We've been seeing it over and over again. So a man bows down to him, and this Amalekite says that I've killed Saul and you should reward me. And so here's the big test. David, have you learned your lesson in the wilderness? And he does. Look at verse 14. David says to him, how is it that you were not afraid to stretch out your hand against the Lord's anointed? How dare you raise your hand against the Lord's anointed? So David has one of his young men strike him down and kills him. And so we see David developing, but a few things are interesting here. You know, our theme of ironic retaliation. Saul didn't fully kill the Amalekites. Look who reports his death. It's an Amalekite. If you pay attention to scripture, you'll see this over and over again. God using irony to communicate points. And he's such a genius that if you don't follow him, he can make a mockery of you by using the very thing that you wouldn't follow him with. And that happens here. And you see some things with this Amalekite because he reports some truths of the story. It's almost like he was there and may have been there. And even some commentaries say that he may have been a scavenger who stayed on the outskirts of battle and waited on soldiers to fall to strip them of their valuables. But the point of the matter is that he lies. And the main point we want to gain from this chapter is when David learns about the death of Saul and he gets his big test, he passes it. And he has this funeral lament in verse 17 and following. He says, "Tell it not in Gath." You'll see that in verse 20. Saul's dynasty is dead. And it's something interesting. You got to mark this because Micah is going to say the same thing about David's dynasty in the book of Micah. And so David is playing off of this. He's going to say, "Tell it not in Gath," which is indicating that the Davidic dynasty is dead. But Micah is using a play on words. He's saying that you're going to need someone to raise up the Davidic dynasty from the dead, which is why your next king needs to be born, guess where? In Bethlehem. And we get that language in Micah. And so stay with me because we'll work through the major and the minor prophets when we get there. Another thing that it says here in this lament, in verse 21, it says, "Let no dew or rain be on you, nor fields or offerings." And this is curse language. And something that has been pointed out to me by theologians that are a lot smarter than I is that they demonstrate how God unites and links nature to kings. Remember, even you see this in Genesis, where nature was waiting on Adam. In fact, the animals would come to him to be named. And even here, when a king dies, it's not to be any dew or rain. So David is building on this and establishing this. But where also does this happen where creation is tied to a king? You remember what happens when Jesus dies on the cross? That's right. An earthquake, darkness fills the sky. Because when a true king dies, creation must and will react. And we see that lament here by David. And there's so much beautiful theology here in this psalm and this lament, if you were to work through it. Just like Hannah's song, so much beautiful theology in her song. It's the same thing here. So we move into chapter 2, and David is made king over Judah. So he's not king over all of Israel. He's king over the tribe of Judah. And Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, is made king over Israel. So David is told to go to Hebron. And it says that again in verse 11, that the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. And so you're going to start to see this mini civil war develop. Because remember, Saul's commander-in-chief, Abner, is still alive. So he's mentoring and advising Ishbosheth. So there's this battle here between the young men in this contest. And it says in verse 15, "So they arose and went over by count 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 for the servants of David. Each one of them seized their opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side." And it says that day the battle was severe, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. And after that, you get this scene from one of Joab's brothers, Azael, and he's a very fast guy. It says he's swift-footed, and he's pursuing Abner and chasing him down. And Abner is telling him, look, to stop. But Asahel, he wouldn't stop. And Abner is saying, look, how then could I lift up my face to your brother if I were to cause you harm? But he refused to turn aside. And so Abner strikes Joab's brother and kills him. This causes the other two brothers, Joab and Abishai, in verse 24, to pursue Abner. But Abner reasons with Joab. He says in verse 26, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the end? How long will you refrain from telling the people to turn back from following their brothers?" And Joab said, as God lives, if you had not spoken surely, then the people would have gone away in the morning, each from following his brother. They halted their pursuit of Israel, and they no longer continued to fight anymore. But in the course of this battle, in verse 31, it says, but the servants of David had struck down many of Benjamin and Abner's men, so that 360 men died. And they took up Asahel and buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. Then Joab and the men went all night until the day dawned in Hebron. So we're about to see another aspect of a good king. A king needs to have military might and military success. And so you see God developing that with David, and he's about to develop it even more. We're going to see tomorrow where Ishbosheth is going to accuse Abner of treason and sleeping with his father's concubine. And this is going to cause Abner to help David transfer the rest of Israel under his kingship. And Joab is going to eventually kill Abner in the city called Hebron. And we got to remember that. Remember when we walked through Joshua, Hebron was supposed to be a refuge city where you would go there to flee and you wouldn't be murdered there. And so this should have caused a riot. But we'll see tomorrow that David just writes a song and makes it all better. God is just making David this uniter and showing that he's the true king. He's almost like Joseph. Whatever he puts his hand to turns to gold. You're just going to see it tenfold with his son Solomon, which is called the golden years. And my practical application today may not hit home as much for you to do something with your hand, but I do want you to do something with your head and your heart to continue to form your theology of kingship and to know what a true king looks like and what a true king does. A king has to be able to bring peace. He has to be able to unite the people, and he has to have God's approval. And so you'll see all of these things develop. So start establishing your theology of a king so you'll know what to look for in your king when you get to the New Testament. So exciting days ahead. Let's continue to work through these chapters. You guys have a good day in the Lord. Love you. Take care.